And it's not just true in this instance. We can go to what I would call sort of the climax of the story. This is on page 231, 232. Again, the same sort of issue. The two of them have been sampling different kind of drinks. We get a sense that sampling drinks and going and looking at things is sort of what they do. And in some ways, I guess you could say it's like for people who go to Europe from America, it's kind of what you do anyway, even now, 100 or so years after the story is written. This kind of life seems to be wearing on the young woman, whereas the young man seems a desire to kind of continue the life he has right now. Doesn't it mean anything to you? We could get along. Of course it does, but I don't want anybody but you. I don't want anyone else. And I know it's perfectly simple. Yes, you know it's perfectly simple. It's all right for you to say it, but I do know it. Would you do something for me now? I'll do anything for you. Would you please, 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 please stop talking? Right? And to the degree we get conclusion or resolution of what's going on between the couple, this might be as close as we come, right? In other words, we are left to sort of deduce out from these details that we have what happens to this couple and how they get along with this. And we have to sort of judge their relationship in some ways upon their inability to sort of share these important thoughts or feelings with her. This is as close, I think, as Jig gets to explaining her feelings on the matter to the American or the young man, whereas he seems very eager to be done with this sort of complication in his life, right? And even in the conclusion of the story, Hemingway sort of leaves us hanging with this sort of sense of questions that we have throughout the story. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. "Do you feel better?" he asked. "I feel fine," she said. "There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine." Now, if we are reading closely and carefully, when we get to this sort of conclusion of the story, I would almost guess to say that her actual feelings are almost opposite of this. She's agitated, she's upset, she's impatient with the man that she's with. This kind of statement of conclusion is supposed to be, I think, in some ways kind of obviously not the case for us. So just some final points of review before we move on to the other story. One of the things I want you to think about as you read works like this one, or anything else we'll read in the course of the class, is I want you to do things like notice patterns, but also anomalies or things in the work that look like they don't make sense, or at least stick out to you in kind of obvious ways. What I mean by patterns are just sorts of repetition that may go on in the story in different ways and different forms. For example, we talked about the plainness of style and subtlety of characterization. Hemingway does not spend a lot of time on description. There's also a lot of stuff that he doesn't tell us, right? These are possible indications of meaning. In other words, the lack of description, the lack of expression may be indicative of a lack of connection between the people in the world around them or between each other and the kind of relationships that they have, right? So one way to think about it is Hemingway is sort of underscoring the difficulty of the alienation the couple feel from each other by the way they talk to each other, by the way they're described, and by the way they sit in the world in which they exist, right? So a lot of this is a kind of pattern where details build upon each other. I will say, too, I use the word possibly here in the PowerPoint that I'm showing you because I don't want to give you the idea that I think that there's necessarily one interpretation or one single unitary meaning each story may have, that there are possibilities that these things may work to. And even these possibilities often sort of present questions to us in ways that we as readers and interpreters have to understand. So, for example, you might come to the notion that this relationship and relationships in Hemingway often are sort of indicative of a kind of both, you might say, self-deception between the couple and a lack of expression between one to another. They don't necessarily tell each other what they're thinking or what they're feeling through the course of the story. That leaves us, though, I think, with questions about how we may interpret what Hemingway is doing in the story. How much are relationships dependent on things not said? And what I mean by this, and you may imagine relationships you've been in, we are not always perfectly honest, right? And from a psychological standpoint, it's hard to tell someone else everything about oneself, right? And I think Hemingway is hitting on that here in a very strong way in this story. So, are these kinds of self deceptions or deceptions for other people necessary parts of a relationship? Or perhaps Hemingway is trying to differentiate between the less important relationships in our lives from the more important ones? Do relationships suffer because of these kinds of deceptions or the lack of like detail or honesty that we present to other people, right? So the pattern here is the kind of plainness of style, but what we make from that is sort of our interpretation or argument we have to fashion from those details. An example of anomaly or something in the story I think might present itself as important to us is something I referred to earlier, the way that Hemingway refers to the characters. The male in the story is either the man or the American. This is kind of interesting because, in fact, both characters, I think we're supposed to understand, are both Americans. While she is referred to as the girl, he is the man, right? It's a diminutive form. Also, jig, which I think in past, I think reasonably so, some people have sort of suggested is more a young girl's name or a name we would associate with immaturity as opposed to a mature name. So again, this is a kind of an anomaly or a way that Hemingway designates these people. The man doesn't even have a name at all. And again, I think that this is a kind of something unusual, or as I would say, an anomaly that's important for the meaning of the story. What specific theme or idea we take from this anomaly, again, I think is up to us to fashion. And what I mean by that is there are ways we can look at this kind of writing and suggest different things. You might make the argument that actually Hemingway is guilty of a kind of male sexism, that his writing is therefore limited because he has issues with writing women, or that he has a limited sort of imagination in this regard. Or we may try and make the argument that actually Hemingway is very much aware of this aspect of his story, and that he's actually arguing against the kind of sexism that might be indicative of male characters or young men in these kinds of relationships. And it would be the details of the story that we would have to fashion into arguments when we make our own interpretation in the kind of papers we'll be writing this semester, right? And we will talk more about that as we move on. All right, let's turn quickly then to the Robert Frost